Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us today. We're so glad that you're here. You know, the Women's Forum is a community of professional women that comes together to support the personal, the professional, and the financial success of one another so that we can all live empowered, fulfilling lives.
So we have a really wonderful program for you today. I know you'll be inspired and you'll be able to take away a few nuggets so that you can use them in your life to create change and enrich it in ways that matter to you. So sit back and relax and enjoy the program.
So, you know, we've had such an overwhelming response to this program, but neither Barbara nor I are surprised because since we started the Women's Forum back in May of 2015, women have consistently come up to us and approached us or emailed us and asked us to address this specific topic, having difficult or uncomfortable conversations. So we're delighted for everyone who, as I said, has expressed interest and is joining us today. You know, I think that we can all admit that there's usually a lot at stake in these exchanges. You know, whether you are negotiating your compensation package or asking to be assigned as the lead in that high-profile project, or you need to hold a colleague, a friend, or one of your kids accountable, or you're, you know, talking to your spouse or your partner about uncertainties in your financial life, or just difficulties in a relationship. You know, we become anxious, strange behaviors pop up. We feel that perhaps we cave or we don't honor our boundaries during these exchanges or discussions. And often we come away feeling defeated. But it doesn't have to be that way. You know, honest and clear communication coupled with, you know, a proper mindset and thoughtful preparation can have a huge impact on the success and the outcome of a conversation. You know, and we see the difficulty quite often in the work that we do in our business, and we get it. You know, money is very, very emotional. People come from different money stories. They have different values, different experiences, and different money habits. Now, given that so many of you are new here today, that this is the first Women's Forum program that you're attending, let me take a moment and tell you what I'm referring to. So as an independent fiduciary investment advisory firm, we invest in conversations and partnerships with individuals and institutions based on two fundamental principles: trust and transparency. And working with individuals, couples, and families, generally with 2 million or more in investable assets, we take a very holistic approach and talk through and listen through every aspect of their financial life. But it's interesting, in many cases, people don't know where to start when talking about money. They don't know how to approach the subject. They don't know what questions to ask. They don't know how to articulate or agree on their financial goals. They don't know what wealth means to each other or what an optimal wealth strategy might look like. As advisors, we often help facilitate and simplify those difficult discussions around finances. Our role is not only as an advisor, but in many cases, we're a coach, a counselor, a therapist, and I use that term loosely because we have therapists on the call today, an accountability partner, and always as an encourager for our clients to help guide them through these discussions, because there is nothing more fulfilling than seeing our clients emerge from these conversations with more confidence and clarity, and even if there are more discussions to be had. And then, of course, on the institutional side, we serve public, private, nonprofit organizations, helping them manage various pools of assets from 401ks to 403bs, foundations, and endowments. And we take that same holistic approach and supportive partnership nature to ensure that they're operating at the highest level. And then, of course, for both individuals and institutions, we provide asset management services. So if we can offer support or help guide you through a difficult discussion about your own wealth or your own financial future, please let us know. We're happy to help you through that and support your success. So now to our program and our speakers, and we're so excited that they are here. Kimberly Cook is the founder and principal mediator of Dovetail Conflict Resolution. Prior to founding Dovetail, Kimberly enjoyed a distinguished legal career as an esteemed litigator at one of the country's premier divorce and family law firms, representing high-profile clients. She's known for guiding families through complex family law matters, including prenup agreements, divorce, parenting matters, property division, child and spousal support. As a mediator, she approaches every case with consideration of the unique circumstances which give rise to disputes, and provides guidance to help individuals navigate through an issue while giving them the resolution and tools to move forward. And Dr. Ammara Khalid is co-founder of CORE, CORE, which stands for Center for Relational Empowerment. And she is a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in individual, couples, and family therapy with children, adolescents, and adults of diverse backgrounds. Her area of expertise is working with individuals who struggle with depression, anxiety, relationship, and divorce issues. And she practices cross-cultural psychology and draws heavily from internal family systems. She's traveled extensively internationally and enjoys working with clients from all walks of life to help them find answers to their problems. So Kimberly and Ammara, we're delighted to have you and look forward to hearing how you can help us guide ourselves through some difficult conversations.
Well, thank you, Nancy. I'm so honored to be able to have this conversation with everyone this morning, and of course, I could not be more thrilled to have it with Dr. Khalid, because I think she is the bee's knees when it comes to having these discussions and helping to guide these discussions. So I'm completely honored, and having some of the comments in the chat, which I think helps us kind of get into the mind frame and of the conversation today is really helpful to kind of see what people have already been doing and how women approach the conversations. So with that, one of the things that I heard you say, Nancy, this morning, which really I think resonates and really kind of helps frame the conversation, was the work that you and Barbara do with your team really centers around these ideas of trust and transparency. And, those words really have real meaning when we think about difficult conversations and how we are approaching these conversations, how we feel in these conversations, and what the outcome is. And so whether we are discussing money and working with advisors in those supports, or working with therapists, or working through the mediation process, coming back to the idea of trust and transparency, I think is really big. But I think it's also important to kind of frame this discussion with a recognition that here we are in Women's History Month, and we as women are having a conversation about difficult conversations and how to approach this. I would wager to bet, and I'm not a betting person, that there's not a man's group who's sitting around, worried about approaching and discussing difficult conversations. And I think a lot of that has to do with us being women, but even beyond that. And so, Ammara, one of the things that I know when you work with your clients, it really starts from a place of, where do these feelings come from, and what are we grounded in? And I think with difficult conversations, it's more than just that coming to that particular conversation, right?
Exactly. Exactly. I think that, as we're talking about this, and thank you so much, Nancy and Barbara, for having us on here. The word that comes to mind for me is context, understanding the context that we come from. Because why is it that makes one conversation difficult for one person over another? So each of us have a different context that we're coming from. And that's why it's important to examine what were the rules around having a voice? What were the rules around speaking up or talking about something that made ourselves or somebody else in our family, in our community, uncomfortable or uneasy? And different families have different rules. So maybe talking about money was something that everyone did around the dinner table growing up. Maybe nobody talked about money growing up. And so how do you bring yourself to unlearn some of those rules that are so deeply ingrained and internalized psychologically and find that voice? Because I think as women, a lot of us struggle with even just the idea of speaking up. We're told from a very early age, be nice, play nice, don't make waves, don't speak up. We learn to people please so much. And so we really end up losing our voice and losing our assertiveness. And to reclaim that is a really empowering journey.
Oh, absolutely. Just again, from personal experience, I think I have shared with you before that, culturally, my experience with kind of speaking up really was, as a child, you were seen, you were not heard. And so it took, years to really come to a place where I felt it were appropriate in certain circumstances to speak up, because depending on who's in the room and to your point of context, a lot of times if there is someone who is older than I am or someone who is at more of a authority kind of position, I really kind of fell back or defaulted to that child, like, nope, you don't speak up, you don't speak out of turn, you don't voice your opinion, because it was, really childlike. I have since, learned, except when it comes to my mother, I'm not there yet, that it is appropriate and it is important for me to give voice to that. One of the things, though, I think is really important as we talk about, kind of the tips and thinking about conversations, that I cannot stress more is this, the importance of safety. Mm-hmm. and recognizing that when you are approaching a conversation, and whether that's with a significant other, whether that's with an employer, whether that's, with an individual that's a friend, you always want to make sure that you are safe and engaging in someone who has the capacity to participate in the conversation without harming you physically, or emotionally. Because sometimes coming into a place where we have now gathered the courage, we have now prepared ourselves and all of the things that are important to do to prepare for a conversation, it's not safe for us. And so, knowing that, first and foremost, safety, and maybe that safety means having the assistance of someone else and not going into that conversation by yourself, and recognizing that there are methods. Ammara, that safety is a real piece for you in working with clients and understanding how safety works as it relates to as they approach different things.
Right. The trust piece is so important. As a psychologist, as a therapist, we are very mindful of safety in the room, and especially when clients are having difficult conversations with me as their therapist, right? It's not always easy to talk about some of these things. And so, I was so happy to see that so many people in the chat feature mentioned breathing, because breathing really helps to create safety. The primal brain indicates cues when we are unsafe, when there is danger. And so the brain says, okay, are you safe? What do you need to do? And that's where the fight or flight mode takes over. And same thing happens, even though we don't have saber-toothed tigers running after us, the same thing happens when we're faced with anxiety, with discomfort and fear. And so breathing before having a difficult conversation is so, so important. It's almost more important than trying to think yourself out of it. I think a lot of times we make the assumption that I need to control my thoughts. We really don't control our thoughts. Our thoughts control us. What we can control, though, is our breathing. And rather than trying to control our thoughts to help us regulate our body, if we start with the body, it's a much faster connection. And it sends a cue to our brain. You're safe. You're fine. There's no attack here. You're going to be okay. And so that's why breathing is so, so important. Even after a difficult conversation, continuing to take a few deep breaths, helping yourself calm down, regulate, can go a long way.
I love this. You can't control your brain. You can control your breath, right? Because how many times do we try to control our thoughts and then get frustrated with ourselves when we can't, right? When it's I had a plan, it was in my head, this is what was going to happen. And then in the moment, then we're really kind of all over the place. And so I think that this recognition that you can't really control your brain, but you can control your breath, and breathing through the conversation and then after is really helpful. I think too about in breathing and in trust, the word boundaries is coming up for me. And, as a mediator, one of the things that I often, when I meet with individuals first before we have the joint session, I talk about what are your boundaries? Right. And how are you going to maintain those boundaries for yourself? And I think a lot of times we are very much focused on the other person, when in fact it's, okay, I can control myself, I can control my breathing, but to this idea of boundaries. So for example, I know for me, when voices start to get raised, right? I didn't come from a family where there was a lot of screaming, that's not in my space. And so when people start screaming, I completely shut down. I can't hear it. I can't function. I get, very unnerved. And so I know for myself that one of my boundaries is, okay, it's not productive for me to engage in a conversation that then becomes a screaming match because I become very unnerved. And so for myself, I have this in my head of, okay, when someone starts to get, to start screaming or to get really enraged, my response, both to myself and then, I verbalize is, it's not helpful for me to proceed in this way. So I think I will remove myself from the conversation and we can talk later. And it's really more me talking to myself really than to the other person, even though it's directed at them, because it's my, hey, Kim, this is pushing beyond your boundaries. And so when I verbalize this is not productive for me, it's I'm now protecting that boundary. It's the same way with another one is I don't want to say cuss words, but vulgar language, or I don't respond well in that way. And so, I'm very clear when someone starts using language that makes you really uncomfortable to say, it's really not helpful for me to engage with you in this way. So I make it more about me than the other person in identifying and recognizing, my own boundaries. But, with boundaries though, I know that sometimes it is this expectation that we can set boundaries for other people. And, how do we kind of establish and maintain those boundaries, especially when we're engaging in a difficult conversation?
And what you said is so important because, you've done a great job of developing that self-awareness around what makes you safe and what doesn't. What are your boundaries? So many people don't have that awareness, right? And so you go into a conversation, you're feeling terrible about it, but you don't know why. Or you assume that it must be me. I'm doing something wrong. I didn't say the right thing. I should have, approached this in a different way, or I shouldn't have had this conversation altogether. So it's really about having that self-awareness and being aware of what my boundaries are and then enforcing them. Having a difficult conversation doesn't mean you see it through the end. If you are not feeling respected, if you are feeling like this is not going well, it's also okay to bow out and have it at a different time. We just believe like, oh no, we have to power through this and just get it over with. How productive is that really going to be? And so I think it's okay to scale back. And again, coming back to the body, if breathing is working for you, if something I use a lot is progressive muscle relaxation, which is a technique where we start from the top of our head, relax every single muscle in the body, working all the way down to our toes, or some people like to start from the feet, work their way up, but allowing your body to release the tension, the tightness, because especially as women, we hold so much tension and tightness in our bodies. We get migraines, our neck and shoulders hurt. Even now, notice how you're sitting. How are you feeling? We carry a lot of tension in our lower back and hips. So there are ways in which the body really holds on to some of these emotions and these feelings. And it's so important to let that go, relax, breathe, and just doing that will help you be in a different frame of mind.
I could not agree more. I saw a chat comment that popped up that says, you can control yourself. You can't control the other person. And I couldn't agree more. And there have been times where to your having the difficult conversation doesn't necessarily mean you're seeing the entire conversation through. It's, I think, important to keep that in mind, because if the response from the other person is not productive, or it's not going in a direction where you can productively and safely engage, knowing I think this was great for us to start, but I think we're now going into a direction that's not helpful, or I think we might need to take a step back, or those things are all important, because not only are they boundaries, but it is about safety. And it's about kind of taking that moment to say, okay, I need to step back. Now, listen, I know it's easier said than done, right? We've all been, and it's easy to say, you could just stop it in the middle of, and it's not, the practice of doing that is difficult when you feel like you're in the heat of the moment, right? But I think it's important, though, to be able to say to yourself during that time period, okay, even if I may not be getting the response that I wanted or the answer that I wanted, is this conversation actually productive? Because there's a difference. So for example, a lot of times when I'm dealing with, family and divorce issues, and we start talking about, maybe it's, the finances, maybe we're delving into the conversation about the division of assets. And it is very apparent that someone has thought through what they want to see the outcome to be, and they're committed to that. But the conversation is productive because information is being shared, and there is transparency, or not, because that also is a way of informing one when you're getting kind of stonewalled or things are not being answered. And so there's this kind of fight or flight that I see coming. And a lot of times I'm the person saying, hold on a minute, let's take a step back and let's think through what we're hearing. Because while it may not always be what we want to hear, it is certainly productive as a part of the overall conversation. And so I think that's important to remember. We don't just shut down the conversation if it is in fact, productive for us.
And I think, Kimberly, if I can jump in here. So in the piece where you had mentioned earlier that if you feel unsafe, that if you feel threatened, it's just not going, if people are raising their voices or using profanity, you have to be your courageous self and physically remove yourself in many cases from that conversation.
Yes.
And that's okay. That's
Yes.
okay. You're not saying it's the end of the conversation, but you are removing yourself. There's a lot of remarks in the chat about preparation, about having, your key points to convey and so on. Maybe you can speak to a little bit about how best to go through that method, how best to prepare your thoughts and be sure that you hit on all of the things that are really relevant to you.
Sure. I think, preparation is key, and preparation can look like a lot of different things, right? So I think, gathering information, coming to the conversation. So whether it's, I want to raise, and knowing, here are all of the things that I put in place before, whether it's talking to your spouse about, your finances, here is the information about this specific topic is important, but also the preparing yourself for the conversation. And so working with your therapist, I think, Ammara, wouldn't you agree that in preparing for a conversation, working through the conversation or the issues in therapy can be very helpful to preparing you?
Right. And having a clear list of goals, like what is the outcome that you are hoping to achieve here? Sometimes it helps to write things down. Sometimes it helps to create a mind map. There are lots of different ways you can list things down and have a clear idea of what you're wanting to achieve from this conversation. But the other piece is really about preparing your body, preparing yourself, and being relaxed and recognizing that even if things don't go your way, there can be times to come back to it. So when thinking about goals, I think sometimes people get stuck in sort of this mindset that if I don't achieve this, then this is the end all be all. And that's really not the case. Most of the difficult conversations you've had throughout your life have happened over multiple times in multiple situations, and I see this with couples all the time. They don't come to couples therapy, resolve their arguments, and then they're done. That's just wishful thinking.
It's a process.
It's a process.
Yeah.
And so, we're going to have to talk about, the laundry and the dishes several hundred times. And I will hear the same argument over and over again. But it's the process of having to voice your needs. It's the process of having to say, this makes me uncomfortable, or this hurts my feelings, and doing that over and over again because we're just not used to that. Right. And we want to make things smooth and easy for everybody. And so recognizing, that difficult dialogues in couples or in families help us grow is a way to reframe the idea of having a fight. And what does that mean about our relationship? It doesn't mean that it's headed for doom and gloom. It just means that we're both invested in this, and it's worth talking about. It's important to us.
Yeah, that's a great point.
The other thing when we're talking about, this preparation and how to really kind of frame and prepare, I'm going to age myself here, but I am all about pen and paper. And a lot of times what I do in preparing for a difficult conversation, I put down, you talked about your goals, but on the other side, so I draw a line down the middle of the paper and I put down all of the things that I want to address, or here are my goals. And then on the other side, I put down, what is this other person? What are, from their perspective, how would they look at this? So if I'm sitting in their shoes, right? What are their goals? What are their thoughts? Or what are their concerns? Because a lot of times when we put things down in written format, we can see them. We can step away and then come back to them. So I think it's really important to look at here's where I am. here's where this other person is, but doing it in a way where it's not just in your mind, because sometimes that's not kind of the separation that we need. And I think that's preparation. But the other key to this, using certain supports and preparing. So those supports can look like working with your investment advisor, working with your therapist or your lawyer or a trusted colleague. There's no book that says you can't role play or you can't ask questions or you can't say, what do you think about this? Because sometimes we need to be challenged in our thought process before we kind of present the or engage in that conversation. So I think it's really helpful at times to write things down from where you are, what your goals are. And then on the flip side or on the other side of the sheet, think about, okay, this is what this other person may say or may think or, may be considering. And how will that impact where I am and the importance of that?
Yeah, and it's interesting. We have a question here about, I'd love to hear about taking the other into consideration. How do you best prepare for that when you are so focused on your own point of view? And while you cannot read the other person's mind, perhaps that's a place to talk about in the conversation that, this is what's important to me. I'd like to hear what's important to you, these, kind of thing. And I want to be mindful of our time, but maybe you can just spend a couple seconds on, how do you consider, in addition to writing down, is that how you would approach that by saying, hey, this is how I think you might feel? Maybe you can validate that or we can talk through that as well.
There are a few layers to this. For example, when I have a very high conflict couple in the room, I'll sometimes interrupt their conversation and have them take each other's seat on the couch. And now they're going to continue the conversation, but as the other person. So that really forces them to take the other person's perspective. But it really depends on who you're having the difficult conversation with. Sometimes you don't have that relationship that you do with a spouse where you have enough insight into assume like, okay, how might they respond or how have they responded before? Mm-hmm. And so part of the equation is, trying to think of different points of view, but some of it is also just letting go and trusting that if they have a difference of opinion, you can talk it out. And that a difference of opinion doesn't necessarily mean they're shutting you down or they're not open. It just means maybe they're asking questions. Maybe they don't understand. And so not seeing a question as confrontation.
Right.
But recognizing that there may be aspects that we're just not communicating and that we can be open. And that's key, right? Is to come into this conversation with a sense of openness. Because if you come into any conversation with your guard up, the armor is on, the gloves are on, it gives that sense that you're not open and they may then be more confrontational than you intended.
Oh my gosh, I want to underline and highlight, question does not mean confrontation. And I think sometimes when we approach a conversation, we're so anxious and we're worked up and we've prepared and we're ready and a question is then asked and all of a sudden it's, and so I think it's really important to take that step back and say, okay, how do I process this question? How do I then approach and respond? Because it's very possible that it's really about information and information gathering. Again, the trust, the transparency, trusting that I've done the work, I've prepared to answer this question, and maybe you're not, and maybe the response is, that's a good question. Let me get back to you, or let me take a moment, or let me reframe, or in the transparency, which is, what information do they need from me to productively engage in this? The one thing I think is important when we talk about this idea of preparation is, the being prepared doesn't mean that you have all of the answers. So sometimes what happens, we get caught in the preparation mode that we avoid having the conversation, right? And we put it off and we put it off and we put it off. Being prepared also means, okay, this issue has been bothering me. I need to set a date and a time to address it. And so it's really important to not avoid using preparation as the avoidance ticket, right? The other thing is this: when you approach someone about having the conversation, recognizing they may not be ready when you're ready. And so sometimes you have to say, I'd love to have this conversation, or, it's important that we have this conversation. And if the response is, I'm not ready to have this conversation, then it becomes, okay, can we talk about it in 2 days? Or, when, can we, so setting that kind of time so that there's not avoidance, I think is really important.
And I think what brings up for a lot of people is, having these conversations brings up vulnerability. And I think it's a beautiful question that someone asked about, what happens when we're in a vulnerable state? First of all, it's okay to acknowledge that. It's perfectly okay to acknowledge your feelings of vulnerability, because having difficult conversations takes courage. And courage is not the absence of vulnerability. It's being vulnerable and taking the risk, right? And so let's acknowledge, we've talked about physical risk and safety, there's emotional risk and safety to think about. And so being vulnerable allows us to sort of open ourselves up in these conversations. And maybe that's respected and maybe that's not. And so part of the conversation today is also what happens after a difficult conversation. How are you taking taking care of yourself? Because you've done all this work to prepare. What about after? Are you sitting there ruminating on what you should have said, what you could have said? Are you thinking and replaying the conversation over and over again in your mind? That's not healthy. I would suggest taking a complete break from the conversation, go around the building if you can, go for a walk, or do something that allows you a separation from the heightened emotions that you were carrying in this conversation. You can always come back to it. That's fine. You can even write things down, but not right away. Give yourself some time, some breathing space, because if you've come out of a conversation feeling charged, you need to relax yourself. You need to tell your sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system that you're okay, you're safe. And so really needing that time to kind of come back to baseline is so key.
Thank you so much for adding that. If we could close on a soundbite, the one thing that you're talking about really is relevant for work, for friends, for your relationship, but you have more of a hierarchical dynamic sometime at work. And so maybe you could at least offer just a nugget around managing that, because that can be a little more challenging.
I agree. I think the dynamic with work is a little bit more challenging. That's where the preparation comes in, because you're going into that at a different level. And so having the touch points of, okay, these are the things that I know that I'm bringing to this conversation. But it's also, I think, important to identify those supports. So for example, if there is, HR that needs to be a part of the conversation, or if it's the compensation or the payroll department that can provide you the information, especially if you're talking about, your money or your finances. Now, things like sexual harassment or those things require you to take a moment to really think through, okay, here are the touch points, here are the things that I need to address, and finding the supports to have those conversations, because realistically, you're not on an even playing field. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, and mediators, this is kind of the trick, find a neutral location if you can, especially when you're dealing with a dynamic of imbalance, it's employer-employee. So ask if you can meet in the conference room versus, their office, or because there's a shift in comfort when you're in your own space. So when Ammara was saying, you switch seats, or things change when you're not in your own kind of space. So finding a neutral space to have those type of conversations a lot of times levels the playing field in some ways, even if there's an imbalance with employer-employee, even just psychologically.
Great. Well, good. Well, I know we could just go on and on.
Yeah.
Thank you two so much. There's been such great insights, and I know we have a wonderful recap, and you've really helped offer some key elements that we're going to be pushing out to everyone who's participated, as well as a recording if those of you want to re-listen to this. Again, your time and insights are so appreciated. So thank you. I want to also just briefly mention what's ahead in the Women's Forum. Next Thursday, we continue our virtual networking series, which we affectionately call COCO, Connections Over Coffee and Cocktails. We'll have coffee at 8 a.m. Central Time and cocktails at 5 p.m. And it's really an hour-long gathering, or as long as you want to stay on Zoom, to have conversations and connect in a more intimate way to broaden our networks. And in fact, the next gathering will actually be exploring networking strategies, and an executive coach will share a framework to help you have better outcomes from your networking. And then another save the date, April 14th, an hour-long workshop at 11:30 Central Time on a topic we talked about today, but we're going to broaden it in a different way: boundaries and core values, protecting our most critical asset, ourselves. So thank you. For those of us in Chicago, let's hope that this was the last snowstorm of the season. From all of us, it is Women's History Month. What an amazing time for all of us to honor and recognize each other and so many of the sheroes in our life. We have a video that will be coming out to honor that for all of you. We're increasingly excited about more of us getting vaccinated and getting outdoors. So please, in the meantime, stay safe and healthy. We hope to see you on Zoom soon and eventually in person again.